Okay, so in our last recording, we talked a little bit about the foundations of the war, why it's happening, what it's kind of about, especially at the time, and in terms of the kinds of rhetoric and descriptions and conversations and justifications that both sides are using for the war beginning. And I do want to emphasize, I'm not trying to suggest that slavery wasn't the root cause of the war, but I am trying to suggest that the participants at the time, especially in the first year and a half, 2 years or so of the war's duration, are not talking about slavery and freedom as the main contest, as the main issues that the war is meant to decide. So we talked a little bit about the election of 1860. The election is seen by a lot of Southerners as the straw that breaks the camel's back. If Lincoln is going to be elected, then that's going to be evidence of the North's desire to eliminate slavery once and for all, and that the only option available to them if Lincoln gets elected is secession, right? Is leaving the United States entirely. And again, that's misunderstanding what Lincoln is actually saying. But, people don't make decisions based on logic. Oftentimes people make decisions based on assumption or opinion or emotion. And that's basically what's happening here in a lot of respects. So Lincoln is elected in November of 1860, but he will not actually take office until March of 1861. Just like whoever gets elected in November this year, the term won't officially start now until January of 2021, but it was March back in the 1860s. So Lincoln comes into office after lots of very, very serious problems have already happened. His predecessor, James Buchanan, has, to this point at least, always been treated as one of, if not the worst presidents in American history. There's new lists happening all the time, so it'll be interesting to see how that ranking plays out. Buchanan lets the South do virtually anything that it wants, right? He's aware of the secession crisis, he's aware of those things taking place, and he does nothing. And so by the time Lincoln comes into office in March of 1861, he's facing a pretty serious problem. And the focal point of that problem is a military fort in the harbor of Charleston. And this is a fort that was designed to protect the port of Charleston from foreign attacks. And with Charleston, or with South Carolina's secession, right, with South Carolina deciding to leave the United States, South Carolina sees this particular fort now as a foreign occupation, right, because it's being controlled and operated by the military of a different country, technically, at least from the South's perspective. Lincoln and Congress and the Union refuse to recognize secession, right? They say, we don't agree that secession is legal. We don't agree that you have decided to break away from the United States. As far as we are concerned, the country is one thing, and it will always be one thing, and we will treat you as though you are still part of the country until you decide to stop us from doing that, right? So what Lincoln is doing is he recognizes that he's on very shaky ground in terms of using force to compel these southern states to come back into the United States. He doesn't want to appear to be the aggressor. And so what he needs is for the South to fire the first shots. And so the question becomes, as Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor begins to run low on supplies, does Lincoln resupply the fort or not? Does he let the fort just collapse and have to surrender like so many others have already? Or does he decide to send a resupply ship, the possibility, the likelihood being that this will force the South Carolina militia to try to dislodge the Union Army's presence at this fort? And that's what he decides to do. He decides to resupply Fort Sumter, send supplies, let everybody know that this is the decision, so this isn't something that's being done in secret. It's perfectly known, and it does result in South Carolina firing the first shots early in the morning of Friday, April 12th, 1861. So the first shots of the war are fired by South Carolina artillery. The Union artillery positions in Fort Sumter do their best to return fire. It's a bombardment that lasts almost 36 hours, all told, as cannons and mortars and howitzers are lobbing shells back and forth and back and forth. It is then the official beginning of the Civil War. So, the first battle, I guess you could say, of the American Civil War. Ultimately, Fort Sumter has to surrender, so they have to capitulate, they have to abandon their position. The Union will regain Fort Sumter later on in the war, but this is where everything starts, and it is a calculated risk that Lincoln is taking to resupply the fort because he recognizes that the odds are that this will lead to a war. The complexity of the American Civil War is something that would require an entire semester of in-depth study to even begin to touch the surface. Obviously, in our situation, even in the best of circumstances, we wouldn't be able to do complete justice to everything about the American Civil War. So we're going to touch on some of the high points, some of the essentials. The full PowerPoints on Blackboard have a little bit more depth in terms of addressing additional battles or additional kinds of issues. Make sure that you're looking at those because those will be essential when you're dealing with the exams or, asking questions and that kind of thing. But we're just going to touch on the real necessary kinds of components. So the war begins in April of 1861. It lasts almost exactly 4 years. And early in the war, the overall commander of the Union forces is a guy named Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott is an old military man. He was instrumental in the American victory in the Mexican-American War, and that was about 13 years earlier at this point. So Scott comes up with an idea to sort of choke the southern states into submission. He calls it the Anaconda Plan. And the little drawing here is from a newspaper from 1861. And the idea of the Anaconda Plan was a combined sort of strategy that says, we'll use the Union Navy to blockade southern ports, to choke off their access to foreign materials, because the South really didn't have a lot of manufacturing. They had an agricultural system that was fairly productive, but they didn't have a lot of ability to make the weapons and materials that were necessary to actually wage war. And so part of what Scott is proposing is to use a blockade to cut off access to those essential war materials, gunpowder, firearms, ammunition, rubber, the kinds of things that are going to be really necessary to help the South actually fight battles. At the same time, he was going to deploy the U.S. Army along this wide kind of line and basically just exert ongoing, relentless pressure across this sort of large front. So he is replicating the actions of an anaconda or a boa constrictor or that kind of thing, where you're kind of squeezing your enemy into submission. So from the ocean, you've got the naval blockade. From land, you've got this kind of large-scale advance by the U.S. Army. And all told, this would be a slow process, but it would take advantage of northern superiority of manpower, northern superiority of manufacturing and resources, and it would emphasize the South's inability to maintain their war effort with internal kinds of production. Well, Scott's plan probably would have been very successful. It is certainly a very reasonable, realistic kind of an idea. But it runs up against the enthusiasm that a lot of people in the North had for the odds that their military force, that the war itself, would be a much shorter affair, right? The belief that the war wasn't going to last very long. Anything that we do should take into account the fact that this is going to be a quick victory for the North, and everything will be fine. And so only parts of Scott's plan are actually implemented. Hard to say how things would have played out if this had been implemented 100%. Historians can't do those kinds of what-if questions because, right, I mean, there's no way that you can answer it. But it is part of this idea that both sides actually have, to be honest, that their enemy is cowardly, that they're not prepared for the war, and that this thing is all going to be over by the summertime. Scott realizes that that's probably not the case. He decides he wants this long-term plan put in operation, and it never actually goes through. So the first few battles between the Union and the Confederacy are fairly lopsided in favor of the Confederacy. There are a couple of really humiliating defeats, and Lincoln is really through the war all the way until 1864. Lincoln is kind of at wit's end trying to find a general who will actually do all the things necessary to achieve complete victory. So he has some generals who can do some things well, he has other generals who can do other things well. He ends up, unfortunately, having some generals who can't do almost anything well. And this is a kind of a revolving door of trying to find the best person to serve at the head of the Union Army. In 1861, 1862, the person that ends up with that responsibility is a guy named George McClellan. And McClellan will come back again when we talk about later incidents in the war. McClellan is tapped to be the commander of the Army of the Potomac, which is the main branch of the U.S. Army during the Civil War. He's tapped to be the commander of the Army of the Potomac after a really humiliating defeat early in the war at Bull Run. And McClellan is a great choice for one particular aspect of the role of a general, and that is organization and discipline, right? McClellan is great at turning the Union Army into an efficient, effective, disciplined, well-organized, and well-equipped military force. So he improves the training regimen, he focuses on drill exercises, he focuses on discipline, he improves the kind of equipment that the Army has, the uniforms, the boots, the packs, their kit, their firearms, everything. So he turns the military into a powerful force. And this is ultimately going to be a significant contribution long term. Part of McClellan's problem, though, is excuse me, he is an egomaniac. He is obsessively self-centered and paranoid. He is convinced that he is a military genius, and he bristles anytime somebody else has the temerity to offer any suggestions or any recommendations, or even ask him anything about his army, right? He is fanatically proud of the army that he has built, to the point that he really refuses to engage it because he doesn't want any part of the army to suffer. Which, on the one hand, is great if you're a soldier in McClellan's army, but if you're trying to win a war and you never actually use the army, this is a big problem. And so any failures, any kind of setbacks, McClellan is always finding some excuse, right? He's always passing the buck. Oh, well, that was because I didn't have enough support from X. That was because somebody else meddled into my affairs. That was because somehow the enemy found out what I was doing. That was because somehow the enemy had 3 or 4 or 5 times the number of soldiers that we thought they did. More often than not, these excuses aren't even right? He's just picking things out of thin air. And a lot of times he is exaggerating or inflating or misrepresenting the reality of what's actually happening. So McClellan is certainly useful in terms of reshaping the Army of the Potomac into something that will be a fighting force for the duration of the war. But he personally, as a commanding general, really pretty much a failure. But he will be back on the scene when we talk about events of the 1864 time period. So remember who he is. So the Army of the Potomac is active in sort of Northern Virginia and Maryland and that area. But there is also stuff going on in other parts of the country. Some of the earliest significant Union campaigns actually happen along and around the Mississippi River. And so, about a year into the war, there is a battle that is fought in extreme southwestern Tennessee, right on the border with Mississippi. And at the time, this is the largest battle that had been fought in North America, right? So it's a huge, huge undertaking. Almost 90,000 soldiers between the Union and Confederate armies. Massive, massive undertaking. By the end of the day, because this is a battle that only takes a day, by the end of the day, it is the worst bloodbath that America had ever experienced up to that point. And the worst bloodbath in the history of North, Central, or South America up to that point. Somewhere around 6,000 soldiers are dead between the two sides. Another 16,000 are injured. It is a shocking experience, and when the American public finds out about it, it is a very shattering revelation about just how bad this war is going to be. Earlier battles, yes, people had died, yes, people had been injured, yes, there had been devastation. Nothing on the scale of Shiloh. The astonishing thing about the Battle of Shiloh, once the casualty rolls are being printed in the newspaper, it will go on for weeks, right? Where newspapers will have brand new lists of dead and injured soldiers for day after day after day for, a week or two. And so thousands and thousands and thousands of names. It's sort of the rough equivalent of the Vietnam Wall, but in your newspaper every single morning. So just a shocking kind of an experience. Ultimately, Shiloh is claimed as a Union victory. This is one of the events that begins to bring General Ulysses Grant onto the radar of people like Abraham Lincoln. Eventually, Grant will be the commanding officer of the Union forces by 1864, but at this point in 1862, he's just kind of a lesser known officer in sort of a remote theater of the American Civil War. While Grant is fighting on land, the U.S. Navy is fighting a river campaign up the Mississippi River. Initially, they capture New Orleans in late April 1862. This is a big achievement, right? Because this is the South's largest export port. In other words, a lot of the stuff that southern states are selling overseas to try to raise money is going through New Orleans. And so for the Union to occupy that city means that they are going to be able to kind of shut the tap on a lot of potential income that the South was going to need in order to power their war effort. And so by the fall of 1862, Farragut's campaign, combined with what Grant and others are doing on land, means that the Union ends up controlling virtually all of the southern part of the Mississippi River. So basically all the way from St. Louis and Memphis, all the way down the Mississippi to New Orleans and out to the Gulf of Mexico. The only significant obstacle here is a fortified city in Mississippi called Vicksburg. And the Confederacy controls that fort, that city of Vicksburg, all the way up through mid-1863. And this is going to be a kind of a thorn in the side of the Union efforts to control the flow of goods and material up and down the Mississippi. So we'll come back to Vicksburg again when we talk about it in relation to, the summer of 1863. But we will pause here and we'll talk then a little bit more about some of the other battles, some of the other changes and sort of ups and downs of the campaigns in Northern Virginia, in Maryland, and that kind of thing, as well as an event that happens in 1862 and 1863 that will begin to transform what the war is actually about. And that's the introduction of the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's going to be a hugely significant event because it contributes to turning the war away from just being a question of North versus South, Union versus secession, and begins to turn it more into a war about freedom and a war about ending slavery once and for all. So we'll touch on that when we come back again. Let me know if you've got questions about any of the material. Make sure that you're reviewing both the material online as well as the recordings. And I will see everybody back here again soon.